I'm introducing my colleague, Gabe Klein, and Kate. And Gabe, I hired Gabe to run my ZC City office 16 years ago or something like that.
Yeah, maybe
and
17, I don't know.
Gone on to be Commissioner of Transportation in many cities and run
all kinds of things, startups.
All kinds of things. So he is my power buddy.
No, thank you.
There's
and
a
she
lot
wrote
of
the
love
forward to my
happening
book.
on this stage, guys.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. And I also want to encourage, there's a bunch of people in the back. I'm going to encourage you to come up to the front. We've got some seats up here. Gabe Klein, co-founder of Citify, and like she said, former transportation commissioner for Chicago and DC. Robin was talking about ambivalence of cities. How are we going to rectify this problem? How can cities and policy in general try to create this more heaven approach and get away from the hell?
It's such a big package to unpack. But having worked with Robin at Zipcar and then worked in other startups and worked in government, I found that a lot of the people in government were very resistant to saying yes. They start out with no, and then you might convince them to get to yes. And the scooter phenomenon is pretty fascinating because it's allowed us to get to open data, which might translate to TNC data. There's a lot of great things happening. It's a small profile, small format vehicle that takes up the space of a person, right? It's electric, it's zero emission for the most part. And yet cities are fighting it. There's a bit of an ego thing going on. People want control. But the good thing about these companies pushing is that it's forcing issues around infrastructure. That's one of the good things. It's forcing us to examine, number one, why don't we have more active mobility lanes? Should they be bike lanes? There's this sort of bike lane backlash, right? Some people don't like bikes. They feel like it symbolizes something, gentrification. We see with dockless bikes and scooters whole new populations getting on active mobility, younger, people of color, people in minority areas that didn't have access to great transit. But from the standpoint of trying to get people to do these things, which Robin talked about, like reducing friction, reducing cost, it's really on the government side and the business side about coming together and figuring out the right incentives and disincentives. And Robin talked about the importance of pricing the right of way. We think of freeways as free. That's why they're called freeways. And they're not free. And anybody that considers themselves a fiscal conservative should be into the idea of paying for what we use, right? Otherwise, we can't rebuild it. And so, I think, Rob and I both go out and talk a lot to different groups of people, and I think we need to communicate to people that there's spending and there's investing. And we need to invest in our future. And the fiscally conservative way to do that is to get more people on bikes, more people on scooters, more people on transit, more people walking. And it's also healthier. And so we got to give people the incentives to do those things, and then we have to apply the disincentives, which means pricing and reallocating space, raising prices for parking, getting rid of parking in some cases. So it's really about sociology and psychology, right? And it's really about what are the carrots that we're going to give people first, preferably, and then what are the sticks that we're going to give people? And those two things drive behavior because we're basically just big kids.
I just want to add just one piece to what he was saying. So if you're imagining how in heck you can get people out of their cars to get on a bike or a scooter, it turns out that 45% of today's trips across America, not even just in cities, are less than 4 miles, and 15% are less than a mile. So when we're asking you to get out of your car for the trip that's less than a mile, for 15%, it's faster, better, cheaper, easier, more fun. Right. Why is it such a struggle? And I think when we make it safe and convenient, it's not a struggle. It's I'd prefer to do that.
Yeah, but it's really about change management and our culture and our frame of reference. We've all grown up using cars. When I speak to big groups, I usually ask them, because in every city we used to have streetcars, I'm like, raise your hand if you remember riding the streetcar. And inevitably, nobody or one guy or one lady will raise their hand. It's very, very old. But that's the problem, right? Nobody remembers how it used to be, and so we think this is normal. But you talk to somebody from Northern Europe, he lives in Amsterdam or Copenhagen, they think this is madness. They don't understand it. Because in their culture, in Singapore, a license plate costs $30,000 to $50,000 if you want to drive your own car. In Copenhagen, if you buy a Toyota Camry here, it's 30 grand, right? on average. You buy one there, it's 90 grand. It's a 200% tax. But the quality of the infrastructure that they put that money into makes it so easy to ride a bike or get on the tram, right?
Yeah. So when we're looking at the responses of cities in the U.S., specifically in the Bay Area, you know, Oakland has taken a pretty different stance than San Francisco, and we've got the director of transportation for Oakland here. We got SFMTA in the room, somewhere hopefully. When you look at those two responses, you know, SFTA and MTA seem like pretty restrictive, and Oakland has taken a lot more laissez-faire approach. Like, do you see one as more of a bellwether of what other cities will do or should do?
Well, do you want to comment? I mean, I have thoughts. Look, Ed's a friend of mine, Ryan's a friend. They're taking different approaches. I think that's great because we're seeing how it shakes out. I like the permit approach that, you know, let's let a bunch of folks try this out and see how it works from the public standpoint, and then let's see how the companies behave. I do think, like I've watched in DC, we got, I think, 7 different companies. It's a little overwhelming for the government. And when it gets up to 15 companies, it may be really overwhelming. We may end up in more of a concession model where the good actors who come up with the more advanced business models that maybe share revenue with government and, you know, that sort of thing may have more access. I don't know what you think, but we'll see how it shakes out. But the level of experimentation right now is awesome. And it's uncomfortable and it's painful for the cities and for the companies. But I think it's a good thing.
I want to just, there's this tweet that I saw that I want to paint for you guys because I was so amused by it. So it was a picture that's a full-on of a car grill, like an SUV grill. And so that's the photo, and it says, but scooters, as we discussed the safety issues of scooters, I think, yeah. So.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it kind of complicates matters. We talked about it a little bit this morning about the kind of massive amounts of money being invested in the scooter companies. You know, Uber and Lyft bought the bike sharing companies, scooter companies they're working with. You know, big automakers are trying to get into this. So it's like kind of this massive injection of money into this mobility space that seems unprecedented. Is that changing the relationship or the
I want to say this is one of the reasons why we need the shared mobility principles, to which most of those companies have signed on. But the second piece is I realize we're sitting here in America, and most of you guys are Americans. In Europe, I'd say it's been 6 or 7 years where everyone who works in cities knows, has accepted, recognizes cities are not going to have personal cars in them anymore, and that we're going towards there. The US is in arrears. We have also cities that are less dense, but we have some that do have that density. So we're still in a fight, but that is the future. That is the future.
How does?
But coal.
But coal, I know.
No, but it's true. Like, we love looking in the rearview mirror and trying to figure out how we can stay back there instead of looking forward. And it's going to really hose us from an economic standpoint.
The other piece, just as I am in this space and working in this space, I feel like we've spent the last 20 or 30 years as advisors doing this technology push and advice push and policy push. And we definitely need to work on demand pull. I think the person on the street doesn't realize that they're stakeholders. They can't envision this other world. Everyone hates change. People cannot imagine, how am I going to do the trip chaining with my kid to daycare, to work? It just seems totally improbable. So I do give everyone some slack. But so that's one of the pieces I think we need to work on is I'm interested in getting more artists and culture makers and placemakers and more pilots that get people to see and feel and imagine this other world and want to go there.
Yeah. What are some of the lessons you've learned by working, you've been on private and public sides both, but what are some lessons you've learned from being in the public sector to try to bring some of these changes forward?
Well, I found that when I just started saying yes, like, yeah, let's take that meeting. Like, anybody wants to come in and pitch us and talk to us, let's have that meeting. The people below me were sort of like, that's a very weird posture and stance for a government official. But when Rob and I were at Zipcar, like, I remember working on the on-street car sharing program to put private assets on a public street where up to 20 people could share it, and it was controversial. But we knew that it was going to move us forward from a sustainability standpoint. From a cost standpoint, reducing people's total cost of living in the city, giving people, $100,000 more to buy housing with. So, I'm a big believer in public and private coming together. I think that government questions the motives of the private sector, and they should. But I think that The private sector is focused on profitability. The profit motive is good in terms of competition providing great services. The public sector should be concerned more with profitability, actually, as well. And I think the private sector should be more focused on a triple bottom line. And that's what we try to do all day in our work, is to try to get the two to see things the same way. And I think, some people like Uber and Lyft, some people don't. There's good and bad with that, right? With the scooters, though, and the bikes, it's hard to argue with that. Like, we've finally started to align the profit motive with what we want in cities, and it's really forcing cities to think differently. And so, as much as it makes me a little uncomfortable as the government guy, I think it's needed.
I think cities, as I've talked to some startups and large startups, they will tell me that the city doesn't know what it wants and the city doesn't communicate what it wants. And I just thought, wow, that's so incredible. So I think cities do need to say, yeah, our goals are reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, more efficient use of our streets, lower costs and increase equity and access. But they don't state that clearly. And instead, it feels like our business is to protect the status quo, our job is to protect the status quo. And I think, no, that's not your job.
But there are cities that are trying to do things differently. I did in DC and Chicago. Ryan is here. Salita in LA, we were doing a lot of work with her in LA and John Ellison Associates and others on this transportation technology strategy, where basically on the qualitative side, they're saying, we have a mobility bill of rights. These are the things that really matter to us around equity, access, dignity in your trip, and transportation happiness. It's not just about getting there as fast as humanly possible, but what is the quality of the trip? Did you get exercise on the trip? Were you able to read your book or do some work on the trip? And really measuring that. But then on the other side, on the really detailed technical side, putting up a GitHub with the mobility data specification and communicating clearly to these companies, look, you can all play, but you've got to play by these rules. And you've got to share this data. And we have to be able to query your database. But I think it's actually it's making an equal playing field on both sides. And it's causing them to come in and pitch us on here's how we think we could help you meet some of your mobility bill of rights strategies, which is not something they're used to doing.
Yeah, and do you have something?
One of the slides that I took out, to be short, feels like fits in here, is that regulation has not yet understood that we have broken out of old silos for describing transportation. So when we did Zipcar, it was, is this car rental? Should it be able to park in residential, even though it's a private sector company? And then when Velib or first shared bikes, it was the same idea. What, you're going to take right of way and put a private sector operator? Is that public transportation? Then when Uber and Lyft and the TNCs, oh my God, are these taxis not taxis, insurance, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like we have to pull away from those old siloed imaginations and say, what's at issue here? What's at issue is how many square meters are you taking up space? What's coming out of your tailpipe, and how many people are you moving? Because and I'd say the soft of quality and equity, but that's how we should be regulating, not, oh, is this a taxi? Is it a shared taxi? Is it a vehicle for hire? Is it TNC?
Right. Well, it's about what are the outcomes that we want in our cities? And then from there, you can establish your values and your vision and mission, all of those things. There's actually a formula to this. Unfortunately, we get caught up in the tactics and resources area down here before we establish the vision. And then it gets muddled in I don't like scooters, or I don't like TNCs, or I don't like this. Maybe TNCs are breaking downtown San Francisco, and maybe they are adding emissions. But let's base our argument on that and not based on just I don't like it.
Right. I'm going to go to the sidebar in just a second, but one more question for Gabe. Do you want to talk about the AV project you've worked on? I thought it was particularly interesting where you're working deeply with communities and designing the programs.
Yeah. Well, we're actually just getting ready to kick it off, but we're very excited. I guess we haven't really even announced it publicly.
Breaking news here.
Yeah, news here. The Knight Foundation announced a couple weeks ago that they're doing it's really a $10 million program around autonomous vehicles in cities, but the focus is human-centered design and getting outreach and input from the communities that will be affected, hopefully positively, by this technology. And it's not just AVs, it's new mobility, but definitely with a focus on autonomous. And so there will be 5 cities, Miami, Detroit, Pittsburgh, San Jose, and Long Beach, all very different cities. And we're just so excited to be the convener and facilitator for this program. It's a 5-year program. And I think more than anything, we will be like reaching deep into communities and getting them to help us design pilots that will then be fulfilled by private companies and so on and so forth. Ford's involved in some of the cities, some other car companies are involved in others. And I think we're gonna learn a tremendous amount. Like the real experts are the people who live in their neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. All right, Elaine, you got a question for us from the sidebar?
Yeah, I have a question about a lot of these discussions when we talk about, people taking scooters and cars and walking and bicycling and all that kind of stuff, doesn't necessarily get integrated with the conversation about the movement of goods. And so I'm wondering if there's, an integrated discussion in place in terms of that collaboration of the logistics aspects with the mobility infrastructure for pedestrians and people living in those environments.
2 places we're about to go to a meeting on this. One is around data, so curb access and data.
Yeah.
So there is a discussion around what are open data standards that are common for, right now if you think of GIS and mapping, we don't yet have the language for mapping the sidewalk, the curb uses, the lanes, the speeds, the rights of way, and that impacts, of course, both. Same thing with passenger data, similarly. And so that is up and coming work that brings those 2 together. And if I think of fair user fees across all modes, I think we need to include freight in that conversation because freight is increasingly, freight's always been, freight and delivery, we need that. Our cities live and breathe by that. But they've been double parking for a lot longer than the TNCs have been.
Yeah, and no, I learned a lot in DC though, like when we did outreach to UPS and FedEx, because we had a different posture and stance on this, they came in and talked to us. They were getting like $800,000 in tickets a year, each one, right? And I said, well, I'm a business person. Like, tell me, like, how does that work for you? And they're like, not good. Why? Well, because we come in every year, we negotiate with the CFO. We get it down to like $600,000 and we pay it. But if you guys would just charge us for the parking, that's tax deductible. That's like a whole different thing for us. Well, why don't you just park and pay for it? Well, because your loading zones are so small, we can't fit a truck in it. Okay. So when we revamped the curbside, we doubled the size of the loading zones, but they were free. We added meters, but then we gave them in-car meter capability. So like, you have to work with the private sector, and suddenly we're making a ton more money, right? And we're setting a national standard, and we're moving taxis to different streets. So, but now there's a whole conversation about how we deliver and when we deliver. And like, if you look at Europe, they use the big vehicles, tractor trailers, to get things to the edges of the suburbs and almost into the city. They have warehousing. Then they use little box trucks to get them into the city, and they use pedal electric trikes to get things to people's houses. So there's that we need to address, like the form factor of the vehicle. And then if we're doing autonomous vehicles and bikes and stuff and running people around all day long, then maybe midnight to 6 is when we deliver. New York's already done pilots, DC's done pilots, and perhaps those same vehicles are modular. Hello, Moth. And they, at night, carry packages.
Yeah.
I want to just throw into this, although there probably should be another question, as I think about what are fair user fees across all modes looking like, and how we've constantly consumed intangibles free, I'm really concerned about the future of drones, both sidewalk delivery drones and 3D air delivery drones, because right now, that's free. And so when you just mentioned, let's do delivery between midnight and 6 a.m., I think there are these intangible values that we have today that I'm living in a dense urban area, but I'm not, I feel the sky is open and I'm not seeing, the flying taxi only good for rich people and annoying tens of thousands of people underneath. So it's another place where right now it's free, but is it really free? These are things that we value. So I think about delivery, Sundays. So how noisy do we want it to get at night?
Right.
Are we gonna find that nighttime, like, is quietness an asset that's an intangible?
Well,
or Sundays?
Yeah, and so we have those Starship drones rolling around DC all over the place. I don't know if you guys have seen the little ground-based drones. And so that to me just seems like ripe for, this is my personal opinion, ripe for just getting vandalized and stolen, I guess like scooters. And so I saw one day, and I ran up and videotaped myself kicking it to see how far it would go and see how
My
easy
God,
it was.
you are starting the vandalism.
I know.
And
Well-
then you posted it on, on Twitter. No.
Well, I consider this to be a test, but I didn't realize there was a guy
pilot
5 feet
process.
behind that was monitoring it. And he's like, "What the F are you doing?" And I was like, "I'm conducting a test." And then I ran with my little video.
That's the best strategy, run and hide.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're out of time.